Hello and welcome to this podcast on Charles Dickens. In this podcast, we will be looking at the life of Charles Dickens, most especially the experiences that led to him writing the novella A Christmas Carol, which you've been studying. Now, the information that I share with you in the podcast comes from two different biographies written about Charles Dickens, one by Claire Tomalin and the other by Peter Ackroyd. To understand A Christmas Carol, we have to understand something about who Charles Dickens was, what experiences he had, and also some of the memories of childhood that stayed with him right through his writing life. So let's begin with the birth of Dickens. He was born on the 7th of February 1812. He was the son of John Dickens, who worked in the Navy Pay Office, and Elizabeth Dickens. He was born in Portsmouth, but very soon the family resettled to London, and not long after that they moved to Chatham in Kent. One of the reasons why the family had to move so often was due to the fact that his father was constantly in debt and constantly being chased by his creditors. Dickens's early childhood was very, very comfortable. He went to school and he received instruction, teaching in English and Latin from his mother. And then in 1821, he went to a school run by a man called William Giles. However, in 1822, the Dickens family was ripped apart when his mother and father and the rest of the children left to move to London. And for a while, Dickens stayed back in Chatham so that he could stay at school. When he did rejoin the rest of his family in London, his education was discontinued. They simply couldn't afford to send him to school anymore. And to say that he was disappointed is an understatement. Dickens was a very intelligent young man who absolutely worshipped education, and to have that taken away from him was deeply disturbing for him. Things got worse, and the family fell into more and more debt. In 1824, in late January or early February, James Lamert, a relative of the family, offered to employ the young Dickens at Jonathan Warren's blacking warehouse. Now, a blacking warehouse is a place where the black polish for shoes was made, and Charles's job was to fix the labels to the bottles. He was apparently very, very good at this job, so much so that at one stage Dickens and another worker were placed in the window of the factory so that passers-by could see how quickly they fixed the labels to the bottles of polish. And for Dickens, even at a young age, this brought an incredible sense of shame. So these experiences as a 14-year-old left an indelible impression on Dickens. He was never able to forget them. And things got worse for the young Dickens because later that year his father, John, was arrested and imprisoned for debt in the Marshalsea debtors' prison, and he was there for several months. And of course, it was this debt that had led to Charles being unable to continue his schooling, and the fact that he had had to go and work in the blacking factory. Things were made even worse for Dickens because his older sister Fanny was actually at a music academy at the time. The family had decided that her education mattered more than Charles's. This was strange for the time because normally it would have been the young woman in the family who would have been sent out to work rather than the young man. Things did improve, and in 1825 Dickens did recommence his schooling at Wellington House Academy. And after he left school, Dickens had a number of jobs. For instance, he worked as a solicitor's clerk, where he had first-hand experiences of the courts. A little later on, he worked as a reporter for a newspaper called the Mirror of Parliament, which gave him the opportunity um, to see what life was like for the richest, the most wealthy, and the most powerful in the country. Soon after this, his writing career really, really kicked off, and the first full-length novel that he wrote was called Pickwick Papers. Now, in those days, a writer didn't just sit down and write a novel from the beginning to the end. What happened is that the novel was written in instalments, and these were known as numbers. So each month, Dickens had to write the next chapter or so of the book, which would then be published in a little volume. People flocked to buy Dickens's work, and very soon he became something of a celebrity in London. After Pickwick Papers came Oliver Twist, and after that Nicholas Nickleby. And then he moved on to beginning to write a book called Martin Chuzzlewit. And it was while he was writing that book that he first came up with the idea of A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol was very, very different from his earlier work because he wrote A Christmas Carol in one go. It was not published in small instalments. It was written as one book and published on the 19th of December 1843. London in the 1840s was gripped by a terrible recession. In fact, the whole decade was known as the Hungry Forties. The Industrial Revolution had just ended, and what you found in London was a huge disparity, a huge contrast between the lives of the rich and the poor. London was a place of poverty, of overcrowding, of disease. There were young children living on the streets, many of whom were involved in crime, in thievery, in prostitution, and perhaps most alarming of all, many of these children were illiterate and uneducated. And Dickens was rightly concerned about the kind of future that not only these children would have, but the whole city and country would too. It was when Dickens visited a ragged school in London that he first conceived of the idea of A Christmas Carol. Dickens had a genuine concern and compassion for the poor that went beyond most other people of his age. And he visited a school in Field Lane in London in a place called Saffron Hill. And this school that he visited was a wretched place. It consisted of 3 rooms on the first floor of a dilapidated and falling down house. It was in an area of London, Saffron Hill, which was considered to be one of the worst places to live in London. It was a place of filth and disease and every kind of vice. Now, this school had been set up originally by evangelical Christians who were hoping to reclaim the souls of the young, but at the same time to give them some useful learning that they could take into life and employment. Many of these young girls and boys were living miserable lifestyles through thievery and prostitution. They were dirty, they were filthy, they were reckless, and they were illiterate. And when Dickens went there, he said himself that he found, and I quote, a sickening atmosphere in the midst of taint and dirt and pestilence, with all the deadly sins let loose, howling and shrieking at the doors. When Dickens arrived at the ragged school, he was wearing a pair of white trousers and bright boots, and funnily enough, as soon as he entered the room, the children just began to laugh at him. They'd never seen anything so crazy in their lives. And the person that he went with, Clarkson Stanfield, found the smell too much that he quickly left. But Dickens stayed, and he persevered. And he was absolutely appalled by the ragged figures of the children that he observed there. And he told his friend afterwards, I have very seldom seen, in all the strange and dreadful things I've seen in London and elsewhere, anything so shocking as the dire neglect of soul and body exhibited in these children. And his anger at the conditions of these poor children was so much that he immediately suggested that he should write an article on the conditions. He did this, and apparently he also approached the government asking them to consider giving this school some charity. However, unfortunately, the government didn't give the school a grant. So the situation in this ragged school and other ragged schools like it remains desperate. And until the very end of Dickens' life, only one child out of three attended school in Victorian London. Most children were uneducated and illiterate. In fact, in the 1840s, there were more than 100,000 children who had never even attended a ragged school, let alone an ordinary school. Dickens felt that there was a vast sea of ignorance out there, a vast sea of young people who had never been educated, and he feared that once again, not only was this terrible for them, but that this might cause the whole country to sink. In particular, Dickens wanted children to be trained away from crime, um, because he always saw in the back of his mind the two twin phantoms, the two twin ghosts of ignorance and want. And if you've read the story, you'll know that in stave 3, at the very end, these two children come out from underneath the skirts of the ghost of Christmas present. Dickens saw that many, many children had what he called a doomed childhood, and Dickens believed that unless these children were properly taught and their wants were alleviated, got rid of, they would soon rise up and one day tear down the very edifice of 19th century civilization. And this new vision of the world led to Dickens um, conceiving the idea for his new book. His imagination was so caught by what he had seen at the Ragged School in Saffron Hill that within a few weeks of visiting it, he had actually written the whole of A Christmas Carol, this wonderful story of redemption. This was the book that he'd been wanting to write all along, and this was how this powerful Christmas tale started. He thought of it actually on a trip up to Manchester where he was visiting his sister Fanny, but also went to visit what was called the Manchester Athenaeum, which was founded to provide a place of education and recreation for the labouring men and women of Manchester. And so Dickens's book, A Christmas Carol, centred on some huge social concerns of the time. The ragged schools, his own experiences of what industrialism in had brought to London, but also America, where he'd visited the previous year. Dickens had also recently just read a report on the conditions that labouring children were suffering right across London, the working men of Manchester, as I just mentioned, and of course his own past, those hidden memories that he'd never really revealed to anyone. And it was only later in his life that he revealed the truth about quite what had happened to him for that year working in the blacking factory. So all of these things came together and they kind of flowed together towards one little book in his imagination. And that was, of course, A Christmas Carol. Um, it's fair to say that also Dickens was motivated by a couple of other things. He needed to earn more money, and he'd been looking around for another way of earning some extra income. And so the idea of a small little festive book, especially to come out of at Christmas, was very, very appealing. One of the problems was that at the time he was also writing Martin Chuzzlewit, and so he had to take a break at one stage from A Christmas Carol to finish the next number, the next instalment of Martin Chuzzlewit. Also, it's been said, and I wouldn't necessarily write this in an essay, that some of the ideas from the book came from some dreams that Dickens had. Um, Apparently, he had a dream when he was staying on holiday in which a private gentleman and a particular friend is pronounced to be as dead, sir, as a doornail, which, if you know the opening paragraph or so of A Christmas Carol, you will understand how he used that in the book. Once all the ideas were together, Dickens wrote the book remarkably quickly. Um, it was said that a strange sort of mastery had seized him, and as he was writing the book, he was laughing, he was crying, he was laughing and crying again, and while he was writing it, he also took himself on these incredible night walks through the city of London, sometimes covering 10 or 15 miles in a night. And on these night walks, he was walking through particularly the poor and the needy areas of London. And when you read the book, the descriptions just seem so immediate and real. For the first time in his published writings, the whole nature of Dickens's childhood informs the story. So in Scrooge's boyhood, we actually see echoes of Charles Dickens's boyhood. Remember the blacking factory in stave 2 of A Christmas Carol? Um, we see Scrooge literally in a similar sort of place, sitting and reading, just as Dickens had done on his own. The windows are cracked, and his sister, Little Fan, is presumably named after Fanny, Dickens's sister, comes and rescues Scrooge. We also see in the Cratchit family something of Dickens's own childhood. The Cratchit family live in a small terraced house, and this is clearly an echo of the house that Dickens himself and his family lived in when they first arrived in London. The Cratchit family have a crippled infant, Tiny Tim, but in the Dickens family they had Tiny Fred, who wasn't crippled, but was known by that nickname. It's enough to say that much of the power of A Christmas Carol comes from the very real experiences of Dickens's own life. And it shouldn't be forgotten that when he created the character of Scrooge, the money grabbing, miserly Scrooge, it was at the time that Dickens himself was desperate for money. So there's something of Dickens in Scrooge. We also see at the end of the novella that Scrooge transforms. He redeems himself. He becomes far more generous and kind and charitable. And it's almost like we see the two sides of Dickens in Scrooge. The side that was desperate for money, and money had such a power on him for all his life, but also the other side, which was generous and charitable. And in his life, Dickens set up many charities and charitable organisations. Money was very important to Dickens, though, and he said to his brother at one stage, "There is not a successful man in the world who attaches less importance to the possession of money." And yet, in the following month, he was also saying, "I hope to get a great deal of money out of the idea." So Dickens was very ambivalent, in two minds about money and wealth. And of course, by the standards of the 19th century, he wasn't particularly wealthy. But for Dickens, he always thought that he should never think of himself as rich. And underneath Dickens, there was always a fear. And that fear runs through this book, through Scrooge and even through the Cratchit family. The fear of ruin, the fear of poverty, the fear of losing the riches that he had earned for himself, the wealth he had earned for himself, and falling down to the life of the poor and the ragged people of London. In a sense, money for Dickens was a spur to his creativity. Without the constant need to make sure that he was paying the bills, perhaps he wouldn't have written all the books that he did. So in A Christmas Carol, we see a real focus on money. We see miserliness as being vice, as being morally wrong. We see generosity as being virtue, as being good. The book is about how people obtain money, how people exert their power over others because of money, how money can be an aspect of cruelty, how it can destroy a family, how the want of money can turn you into a person like Scrooge, somebody who distances and builds a wall between themselves and the rest of society, and also how greed is a form of sort of human alienation. And perhaps central to A Christmas Carol is how the experiences of childhood can cause somebody to become miserly themselves. So it may well be that Scrooge's experiences as a child being pushed aside by his father, although invited back at one stage, and perhaps as a foreshadow of what will happen to Scrooge himself later on in the novel, those experiences absolutely influence the book. So, in A Christmas Carol, Dickens imagines what he once was, remembers being a child, but he also imagines what he might have become. If he didn't become this famous author, he may well have become a man like Scrooge. And another thing he wanted to do was to recreate the atmosphere of the fairy stories that he had read as a child, although this time one in which he was the real hero. So Dickens finished writing the book at the beginning of December, and it took him only 6 weeks to complete. Dickens also went to an awful lot of time and energy um, to make sure that the book was beautiful. It was bound in red cloth, it had a gilt gold design on the cover, and the edges of the pages were themselves of gilt. It was meant to not only be a lovely story, but a lovely thing in its own right, this book. And it sold for, at the time, a relatively low price of 5 shillings. And lo and behold, it became the most successful Christmas book of the season. In fact, it probably is now the most successful book um, ever. Even in America, some 2 million copies have been sold over the last 100 years. But even more so, the response of the public to the book was very, very enthusiastic. Dickens had a great relationship with his readers, and they really bought into the message that he was um, putting across in the book. Some of his readers did incredible things. There's a story of an American factory owner who read the book and immediately on finishing the book gave his employers another day's holiday. There's a story of another man who immediately ordered a turkey for a poor family as soon as he'd finished reading it. The last thing to think about is the religious element of the book. And this book is about the seasonal spirit of Christmas, not just the Christmases of parties and dancing, but also the Christmas of mercy and love and community and family. The book has a Christian message of redemption and love, and would have particularly appealed to those Christian readers of Dickens. But also, the book needed to be fun. It needed to be entertainment too. It needed to be perfect holiday reading. So the book is kind of a mixture of um, instruction and entertainment. It's a mixture of seriousness and fun. It's almost as if Dickens has written a religious piece, yet filled it with his own memories and all the concerns of the 1840s, the time that he was living in. He had, in other words, created a modern fairy story, and with all the films that we see nowadays, it has remained that way. Some people like to say that Dickens invented Christmas. That, however, is not true. But Dickens was one of the first to have emphasised the very sort of cosy and family, convivial nature of Christmas. It was not yet as festive as we know it to be today, but Dickens really did want it to be. So Christmas cards were not introduced until 1846, 3 years after A Christmas Carol, and Christmas crackers not until 1850. Typically in those days it was just a 1 day holiday when presents were given to children. It was a time of rest. Sometimes there was acting and reading aloud and music and games. But what Dickens did was to transform the holiday by filling it with his own particular mixture of memories and fears and hopes. Perhaps one of the main things was that he made Christmas cosy, he made it comfortable. And one of the ways that he does that in the book, one of his key techniques, is to exaggerate the darkness outside the small circle of light. We see that in the book everywhere. Outside of the house in Victorian London were the poor, the ignorant, the diseased, the wretched, those who were not enjoying the warmth and the flames of Christmas. Many of these people did not have a home, and home is a very important theme in A Christmas Carol. And what we find in the book are many, many contrasts between warmth and cold, between the interior and domestic interior of houses and the horrible, ugly, diseased streets, between the rich and the poor, between the well and the ill. Think of Tiny Tim. Between the need for comfort and people's anxieties about homelessness. He really did capture some of the, the debates and discussions and concerns that were happening in society at the time. Indeed, in Victorian homes, people did their best to keep the outside world at bay. There were thick curtains, there were lace inner curtains too, patterned wallpaper and carpets, settees. Everything was about banishing the darkness from outside and bringing the light indoors. And we see that right through A Christmas Carol. So finally, I think most importantly, he had, for the first time, Dickens, been able to write one book without putting it into shorter instalments. And he'd been able to write a book which fused together his experiences of London at the time and his own memories and his own beliefs and concerns about society. So thank you for listening. If you're going to take three things from this podcast, I would say it should be the following. Firstly, that Dickens's book was based on his personal experiences of visiting the ragged schools and walking the streets of London. It was based also, number two, on his memories of the blacking factory, of being abandoned by his family, most especially his father, um, and that relationship informed much of the book. But also, for number three, this is a book which is somewhere between teaching us a lesson and entertaining us. Dickens wanted to teach us about the plight of the poor, to evoke sympathy for the Cratchits, for Tiny Tim, and for the other poor people living in London. And firstly, uh, so that we would hopefully become more charitable, but secondly, to show that transformation and redemption are possible, and all of us can find them. Yet it had to be entertaining as well. And so when you look at Scrooge, don't just see him as a serious character. He is also a, a larger than life character. He's what we call a caricature. He's an exaggerated version of the Victorian capitalist. And even by the end, when he becomes joyful and he's redeemed, we still see him as an exaggerated character. So never ever forget that this book was supposed to be fun as well as serious. Thank you for listening.